Howdy everyone. So I've been thinking about Mission Impossible a lot lately. After years of having only seen a couple of them, I spent a few nights in 2024 watching every film in the franchise and fell in love with the series. Whether it's because of the relatively grounded heist found in the first one, or the stunt work that defines the later installments, I can't get enough of these flicks. Despite pumping out what'll soon be 8 movies in just under 30 years, each installment has managed to have its own identity. And following another run-through of the franchise ahead of Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning's release in late May, I got curious about why that's the case. Which naturally led to me doing the thing I do best. Copious amounts of research done in the dead of the night in a sleep-deprived burst of mania that'll make the lone gunman from the X-Files look like a bunch of altar boys. So today, I thought it'd be fun to discuss the most compelling answer I arrived at, because it embodies one of my favorite aspects of the medium. It's the fact that each Mission Impossible movie, and cinema as a whole, can be treated like a Polaroid of the world it was made in. When I say that each Mission Impossible is like a Polaroid, I don't just mean that in their approach to filmmaking, or what audiences found entertaining. That goes without saying. I'm instead referring to the idea that each film, either knowingly or not, evokes the era's political or cultural trends, occasionally even preempting subjects and current events before they would enter the public consciousness. The idea that something can act as a sign of the times they belong to is far from new and hardly exclusive to cinema. To quote the textbook Her Story, A History of Women Artists, the close relationship between history and art is a reflection of the cultural, social, political, and economic values of a particular period. Throughout history, many civilizations have recorded their history through various forms of art, including paintings, sculptures, architecture, and other visual media. It's basically that old saying, art imitates life.
No shit!
We can view the work of Pablo Picasso or Andy Warhol as insights into their worlds. Picasso's 1937 painting Guernica depicts the inhuman horrors he read about following the Nazi and fascist Italian bombings of the Spanish town of the same name. It's a document of a real event that happened, based on an eyewitness account of what has since been viewed as a trial for the Blitzkrieg. I don't think I need to elaborate on how that took the pulse of the period past that. Warhol's work became popular during a period of great consumerism and prosperity in America. Because of this, a lot of it reflects the idea of commodity. We all like to make fun of the Campbell's soup can paintings, but they're a comment on larger cultural priorities from the time.
In 1962, what Warhol is doing is he's saying, what is it about our culture that is really authentic and important?
The same applies to film. When you happen to know a bit about the time a movie came out in beforehand, or just know how to do some quality research, you can gain some insights into the culture that bred it. For example, 1954's Godzilla is a clear commentary on the emergence of nuclear weapons. G-Zilla, as the cool kids call him, isn't just some cool lizard dude with spikes on his back. He's a metaphor for nuclear holocaust. His debut film has a somber tone that reflects the panic and dread felt by a nation that had to experience the A-bomb less than 10 years earlier. This original Godzilla movie wastes no time making it clear that continuing to develop new ways to kill each other will spell doom for humanity. Interestingly, we can also look at the American adaptation of the film for a different perspective on the same subject. Godzilla was heavily recut before it made it stateside. New scenes were inserted while others got removed. The message that makes the original a poignant, moving piece of cinema was muddied to play better in the country that used the bomb in the first place. It's the same basic movie at its core, but it reflects an entirely different world from the Japanese one. It's less about the destruction left by Godzilla and more about an American's observation of it.
You saw a monster. He's had too much sake.
Oh, no, Mr. Martin. These island people are very superstitious.
Speaking of America, Westerns are a great example of movies that take the temperature of the time they were made in. One look at classic Westerns from the 40s and 50s is all it takes to get reminded of the nation's perspective on its newfound place as numero uno on the world stage. as well as its relationship with race. Yet, as we move from the 50s into the 60s and eventually the 70s, we can spot disillusionment slipping into the mix. It happens in tandem with events like Watergate or the prolonged war in Vietnam.
Well, I'm not a crook.
How about one last example for the road? Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window came out in 1954 and features motifs that are hard not to compare to McCarthyism. The flick is all about paranoia and assuming the worst in people. Jimmy Stewart's L.B. Jeffries is a photographer whose job is to document the truth, yet he's unable to keep himself from jumping to conclusions when he's stuck home with a broken leg and starts people watching.
What do you do? Are you interested in solving this case or in making me look foolish?
The film may have this turn out to be a good thing, but Jeffries surveilling his neighbor still plays as a reminder that you never know who your neighbors are, and you never know if they're watching you back. It's like I said a few minutes ago, art imitates life, and to add to that, all art is political. To quote an article that Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote for The Atlantic in 2019, art lives in the world, and we exist in the world, and we cannot create honest work about the world in which we live without reflecting it. And while these examples I shared are all from older works, that doesn't mean we can't look at more contemporary films under a similar lens. As Troy Brownfield put it in his 2019 Saturday Evening Post article, How Popular Films Reflect the National Mood, while it's easier to find examples of how these film comparisons play out over time, we can still sense how certain trends are happening today. Of particular note is the sheer number of films that attempt to reckon with the country's record on race. From Get Out to Green Book, from Black Panther to Black Klansman, a larger number of movies grapple with that difficult topic from a variety of perspectives. The success of these films, and others like Crazy Rich Asians, demonstrate that the movie-going public is not confined to one audience and is in fact hungry for different American experiences receiving representation. And when you consider what was happening back then, it adds up that these were the movies people went out to see. There's obviously gonna be a level of variability and hindsight that has to be accounted for when you look back at films like this, but the math generally checks out. People tend to put their money where their mouth is, and in this case, you can use that expression literally. Which brings us back to Mission Impossible, or directly to it if you skip the previous chapter. I guess that was an option too. Its status as a long-running spy franchise puts it in a very special position, one that it only really shares and comes up short when compared to the 007 series if you think about it. The fact that Mission Impossible is about espionage means that it can be used as a litmus test for the last few decades of politics and technology. Pat Castles, the one that got his start at College Humor, put it well in an article he wrote for the Los Angeles Review of Books entitled On Mission Impossible and Unaccountable Government when he said, "Over time, Ethan Hunt and his geopolitical exploits have remained a rare cultural constant through a time of real-world geopolitical upheaval. Mission Impossible's 6 installments have been with the United States across 3 recessions, 5 presidents, at least 2 wars, and a global pandemic. That's the kind of longevity that transforms a franchise from a series of ephemeral blockbusters with loosely connected plots into a quasi-reliable witness to history. We thought we'd been watching Tom Cruise, but all this time, it's been Ken Burns wearing a latex Tom Cruise mask."
Do you have any idea what the hell he's talking about?
No.
By studying the threats that Ethan has had to hunt over the years and the tools at his disposal, we can get a primer on the last 30 years of history. Things may not be one-to-one with what we're dealing with in the real world and take a predominantly American perspective, but we can still get reminded of them in the same way that Godzilla warned us about nuclear proliferation. We can see how the series' tone has changed over time, similar to how Westerns have changed. Or how Tom Cruise would make a great paranoid L.B. Jeffries in a Rear Window remake. He could even break his leg for real, then run around in the cast if he wants to keep doing dangerous stunts. Not that that would even be the most dangerous thing ever done in a Rear Window remake, as Christopher Reeve let someone cut the real tube for his ventilator in the 1998 one.
I'll let you get some rest now. I'll try and visit you again soon.
As for why we would want to investigate a film this closely to begin with, it's because reflection is good. A major theme on this channel is viewing movies from more of a Doyleist point of view, looking at a work as being more than just a sum of its parts and trying to consider the circumstances surrounding its creation. Because by doing that, we're giving ourselves the opportunity to express an appreciation for something on more than a surface level. And when we do that for blockbusters, and not just the so-called pretentious art films the average filmgoer associates with movies that have deeper themes, we're hopefully making art appreciation a smidge more accessible to newcomers. Not to mention, it's fun to look back in time like this. Sometimes you just want to yap about movies you like. So today, I want to take a look at each Mission Impossible film and consider the things that may have, either consciously or not, inspired them. There's a lot to go through, and I don't intend to touch on everything in these movies since this video will be long enough as is, but I want to give this a shot anyway since I'm a strong believer in reflecting on the things we enjoy, even when they're quote-unquote just a blockbuster. Before we continue though, a quick plug. Hey everyone, Future Me here. If you're enjoying this video so far and want to support the channel, you can do so by becoming a patron or channel member. I don't feel comfortable sharing a full sob story with you guys, but I recently lost my full-time job of the past 7 years, and my family recently began going through a minor health situation. Because of this, becoming a patron or channel member is a great way to support these videos I make and help me prioritize continuing to make them as I search for future work. I get a lot of personal fulfillment out of making these videos, and based off of a ton of really sweet comments that I genuinely screenshot and share with my friends all the time, so do you guys. So if you're in a place to lend me a hand, I'd really appreciate any support you can give. Patrons and channel members are now going to get early access to videos, access to my Discord community, Interior Film Discord, special thanks in the credits of future uploads, and up to 2 or 3 weeks early access to any video podcasts I make in the future. For example, Raekwon and I want to bring our podcast Glaring Admissions back soon, and the first episode will come out for supporters sometime in May as opposed to June for everyone else. And if you want to support the channel but don't have a few bucks to spare, I get it. You could still support the channel though by leaving a comment, sharing this video with some friends, or by answering the following question of the day. What is your favorite Mission Impossible movie, and why? My current favorite is Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. I love this one because of how fun it is to watch Ethan and the gang try to work around all their failing equipment, as well as because of how funny Benji is in this entry.
Masks!
Masks indeed, Benji. Masks indeed. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. So right off the bat, we've got Mission Impossible. It came out on May 22nd, 1996, and was directed by Brian De Palma. Bill Clinton was president. We were smack dab in the middle of the US releases of the PlayStation and the N64, and the #1 song on the Billboard Hot 100 was Bone Thugs-n-Harmony's The Crossroads, a jam that's title is almost poetic given some of the stuff we're about to discuss. To revisit Mission Impossible under the pretense of studying the mid-90s is a trip. It really is revisiting the world while it was at a crossroads, since it manages to resemble the one we currently live in while simultaneously feeling far removed from it. Modern conveniences like cell phones, laptops, and the internet exist, but they're presented to us in ways that now come across as quaint. Similarly, there are other tools used in the movie that resemble current-day consumer electronics, such as the IMF's glasses that have a camera in it, or a pseudo-smartwatch. But they still feel like distinctly 90s interpretations of these items. You can also consider the existence of a Mission Impossible film adaptation coming out at this exact moment in history. The 90s was home to a strong push of 60s nostalgia. In that decade alone, we got a sequel series to The Brady Bunch, a separate pair of Brady Bunch movies, Space Ghost Coast to Coast, 2 Flintstones movies, 2 Addams Family movies in theaters, Wild Wild West, The Fugitive, a return to campy Batman flicks, a theatrically released Richie Rich movie, The Beatles Anthology Project, 2 other Woodstocks, the return of the Aston Martin DB5 and GoldenEye, and the first 2 Austin Powers movies. Though we don't consider it a nostalgia film, part of why this first Mission Impossible got made was because the brand was still recognizable, and because the decade it debuted in was hot again.
Oh, groovy, smashing, yay capitalism!
If you consider the fact that the show came back for 2 seasons in the 80s, it wasn't that far removed from the public consciousness either.
Yeah, baby.
Speaking of that 80s series, it's worth mentioning that the 1996 movie and its sequels can technically be viewed as a continuation of sorts of it and the original 60s show. The first scene post-credits is the series' long-running lead Jim Phelps getting an assignment, just like in the show. It's business as usual for fans of the franchise, with zero indication that Cruise is our new lead until close to 30 minutes in when the rest of the team gets killed. However, by the end of the movie, we learn that Phelps was actually the mole that the IMF was looking for all along. Other than how controversial it was to turn MI's lead character into a villain, the choice is kinda brilliant when you consider his motivation and what it represents. Mission Impossible came out 5 years after the end of the Cold War. By then, media had already gotten comfortable reflecting on the changing times, like in 1995's GoldenEye, a film that's explicitly about the end of the Cold War. It's even right there in the original theme song by Ace of Base.
We're in the 90s. Nothing is the same. The Cold War is replaced by different actors using different names.
Character motivations are also of the era. Phelps represents the old guard, and the film revolves around his mission to destroy the institution he feels he's been rejected by on account of perceptions that he's obsolete.
And then one day, you wake up, the President of the United States is running the country without your permission.
And in terms of its stakes, while there are major ramifications if the knock list falls into the wrong hands, the film isn't that concerned about them. De Palma's movie is more interested in personal motivations. Hunt isn't trying to get the knock list because it's the right thing to do or because he's a hero. He's doing it because he wants to clear his name and later clear his parents' name. Likewise, Phelps has a vendetta to settle and is, I don't know, trying to get some money to pay off some legal fees or something. Didn't he bite someone in Manhattan once?
Hey! Hey, listen. Can I ask you something? Listen. Wait. Oh, God!
2 hours later.
Nurse Tully, you have a call from front desk. Nurse Tully.
Why, Jim? Why? There's too much at stake. You're probably right.
Everything is rooted in a brand of American individualism that screams the 90s. An individualism that was quickly falling away due to increasing globalization from new technologies, yet persisted through much of the decade. It's almost telling that Apple did some product placement in this movie because they'd unveil their popular Think Different campaign just a year later, whose slogan embodies this sense of the changing times. I don't think it's that much of a stretch to suggest that Ethan Hunt represents the exact type of person that the Think Different campaign describes. As demonstrated by this adventure, he is a crazy one. A misfit, rebel, troublemaker, and round peg in a square hole.
Kittredge, you've never seen me very upset.
Almost 30 years later, a thing that a lot of people like to say about this movie is that it feels quaint when compared to its sequels. There isn't much in the way of visceral action. Ethan never fires a gun. Humanity as we know it isn't at risk. Cruise's stunts are far from being as dangerous as they would eventually become. All things considered, the film is a mostly grounded heist and thriller flick from a decade full of entries in those genres. In many ways, this first movie is just another episode of the show. It's business as usual from a decade that was largely business as usual. Yes, the 90s brought us the Gulf War and the first attack on the World Trade Center, but the decade itself has the reputation of being quiet. The economy was in a generally good place during this period, growing an average of 4% each year from 1992 to 1999, and advancements in technology brought new creature comforts to the masses. As the drophead in this Guardian article put it, the 90s felt like a holiday from history. Which makes it kind of interesting how Mission Impossible 2 reintroduces Ethan by interrupting him while he's on holiday. Mission Impossible's follow-up was released on May 24th, 2000, almost 4 years to the day after the original movie, and in an already very different world. Clinton was still president, but this was post-Monica Lewinsky, and we were in the middle of what was, up until the past decade, arguably the most controversial election in this country's history. Internet adoption had brought the average number of American homes with access to 3 times what the number had been when the last movie came out, and Santana and the product G&B's Maria Maria was on top of the charts. That last one may sound random to you, but it almost encapsulates the general vibe that MI2 brings to the table. You see, Maria Maria was a cut from Santana's 1999 album Supernatural, a record that you could argue barely counts as a Santana joint at points. For while the man and his band are on every song on the record, a lot of it relies on a series of guests and sounds that feel in step with the turn of the millennium. Much of the character and substance that defines Santana's best work feels a bit sanded over, which more or less gets at the heart of Mission Impossible 2. Where the first movie was an unexpectedly subtle slice of heist storytelling served up by Brian De Palma, the second one goes all in on bombast. It's panache incarnate brought to us by John Woo. The film has slow-mo, doves, explosions out the wazoo, sweeping helicopter shots, and a Limp Bizkit cover of the series theme song. But this all comes at the cost of diluting what made that first movie so special, such as its pace and Ethan Hunt's characterization. As Patrick Willems put it in his Patrick Explains Mission Impossible and Why It's Great video, it's almost like Cruise is playing a different character. The tone is so different in this one that you could take a couple of its shots, regrade them so that they have the same basic color timing, then slip them between shots from The Matrix and have everything feel cohesive. It's so blasé that of all the things it could remind me of, it always makes me think about South Park's Season 4 intro. It has that much attitude. So it's not hard to look at this movie and think, yeah, this is basically 2000 in a nutshell. The turn of the millennium was extremely in your face like this. What we now call Y2K culture was dominated by genres like nu metal and highly polished boy bands. The X-Men wore leather in their movie. Sonic the Hedgehog had just gotten a radical makeover, and the fashion was all about bold choices and loud color patterns. Pop culture took Apple's maxim of think different and ran with it. However, that isn't all Mission Impossible 2 represents from the era. At the end of the last chapter, I shared that the general sentiment held toward the 90s was that it was a quiet enough decade for Americans. I then stated that it was ironic that we would next catch up with Ethan Hunt while he was out trying to take a vacation for himself. And unfortunately, Mission Impossible 2's release happens to land awfully close to when our so-called vacation in the 90s finally came to an end.
Mr. Hunt, the next time you go on holiday, please be good enough to let us know where you're going.
If I let you know where I'm going, I won't be on holiday.
This is clear from the opening scene of the movie when, and I swear it's almost impossible not to connect these dots, a commercial airliner gets hijacked and flown into a mountain. A series of events that are hard not to compare to a certain terrorist attack on American soil from around the same time. Now, am I suggesting that MI2 somehow predicted 9/11? No, of course not. I am, however, pointing out how uncomfortably similar this opening sequence is to that tragic day from just a year later. The similarities don't end there either. The plot revolves around Ethan and company racing to recover a dangerous man-made virus named Chimera before the crooked IMF agent Ambrose can use it to create a pandemic for Big Pharma to profit from. Though this obviously didn't happen in real life, there are still some parallels that can get drawn between the film and our reality. It's worth noting that Chimera is described as being an especially potent flu, and that, upon looking into flu statistics from the late 90s and into the early 2000s, the US had actually just come off of a pretty bad outbreak of influenza. According to a 2022 report, 1998 was the worst year for flu and pneumonia deaths in the US since 1990. Additionally, 1998's flu outbreak even impacted that year's Winter Olympics. So it's entirely possible that MI2's screenwriter Robert Towne had some of this on his mind, even just subconsciously while he was writing the movie. After all, it was well documented in the news. And that still doesn't have to be the end of these comparisons. Despite Chimera being a strain of influenza, it's functionally a generic bioweapon, which people were afraid of getting exposed to around the turn of the millennium. In 1995, the Japanese doomsday cult Shinrikyo released nerve gas into the Tokyo subway system, and they had previously attempted 3 other attacks using other substances, as well as tried to acquire Ebola virus in 1992. Following 9/11, Americans around the country were terrified by the prospect of finding anthrax in their mail. Hell, here's David Bowie talking about his own fears of running into it back in 1999.
As though we haven't got enough problems. Dateline did this thing. Let's recreate what would happen if terrorists threw anthrax down on the American subway. And it went on for about an hour, and I was so depressed at the end of it, realizing that I really mustn't stay in cities where even the tiniest possibility of anthrax being loosed upon me and my family. But then I forgot all about it in a half an hour because Friends came on.
There are smaller connections to reality too. One of my favorites that I felt like sharing is about the villain Ambrose. For while he's similar to the first movie's villain Jim Phelps in that their motivations are heavily fiscal, his means of getting Chimera separate them. Though he does technically try to frame Ethan for the whole thing just like Phelps did, his method of doing so brings things a lot closer to an issue that a lot of people were experiencing at the turn of the millennium: identity theft. Ambrose uses a mask to impersonate Ethan at several points in the film, and this feels poignant since the 90s and early 2000s were riddled with cases of stolen identity. The internet had just opened up a new industry for scam artists to thrive in, and by God, they thrived in it.
The merging technology of personal computing, scanners, and the internet made it easier for criminals to become you.
If the 90s were all good vibes, big-time sensuality, and prosperity or whatever, and the country post-2001 was all about, well, we'll get there momentarily, Mission Impossible 2 is a snapshot of the moment right before disaster strikes. It's so into itself and oblivious to what's going to happen that it accidentally taps into the exact imagery of what was to come. Damn fun movie though. Like, okay, easily the worst one of the bunch, right? But still really fun, especially in those last 20 minutes or so. Well, aside from the part where those punks put a hole in Luther's Versace.
Punks put a hole in my Versace.
Mission Impossible 3 often feels like a response to the brashness of its previous entry. The J.J. Abrams directed film was released following a 6-year break in the series, the longest as far as these movies are concerned, and was released when the US was already well into the War on Terror. The towers were long gone, and we were 3 years out from George W. Bush's infamous Mission Accomplished speech.
Our coalition will stay until our work is done.
It hit theaters on May 5th, 2006, while Daniel Powter's Bad Day was nearing the end of its 11-week run at the top of the charts. And I swear I didn't intend to constantly weave #1 songs into the grander context of these movies, but yeah, A Bad Day is an apt way to describe Ethan's experience in this one. MI3 finds Hunt at a time in his life when he's no longer a field agent. The guy has settled down and found himself engaged to a nurse named Julia. Things are good, at least until they aren't, and he takes on one last field op. This leads to him venturing around the world to obtain another bioweapon, this time called the Rabbit's Foot. Not much is known about this one, and the film never bothers to flesh it out past having it be the story's MacGuffin, but it's bad news, especially since our third crooked IMF agent in a row wants to use it to justify an invasion of the Middle East that the US stands to profit from.
We're talking a military strike within a week, and when the sand settles, our country will do what it does best: clean up. Infrastructure. Democracy wins.
Yeah. That's pretty topical, isn't it? The similarities between Mission Impossible 3 and the US circa 2006 should be obvious. The plan to strike the Middle East was clearly inspired by the war in Iraq. As the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute put it in a 2023 article, the case for invading Iraq in March 2003 was built on 3 basic premises: that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, that it was developing more of them, and that it was failing to comply with its disarmament obligations under a series of United Nations Security Council resolutions. All of these premises were based on scraps of unreliable information. None of them was true. By the time this movie came out, weariness toward the war had already set in. Data from the Pew Research Center shows that support for the invasion had been strong enough to include a slim Democrat majority in 2003, but was also in the middle of flipping among Americans in general by 2006 or so. Meanwhile, the subject of terror was still fresh in people's minds thanks to movies. A lot's been said about 2008's The Dark Knight over the years for how it comments on the war on terror and the NSA, but there are a multitude of other examples. Cloverfield was of its moment because it depicted New Yorkers reacting to an attack that was beyond their comprehension. Spielberg's War of the Worlds is no different, updating the H.G. Wells story with commentary on the war on terror and evoking the imagery associated with 9/11.
Is it terrorists?
This came from someplace else.
What do you mean, like Europe?
No, Robbie, not like Europe!
2008's Iron Man updates the character's origin story to include a terrorist group in the Middle East and has Stark's anti-military profiteering motivation take on a contemporary context in the process. Casino Royale does the same with its change to have Le Chiffre be a financier of terror organizations instead of Soviet counterintelligence. And lest we forget, 2/3 of George Lucas's Star Wars prequels are transparently inspired by the War on Terror too.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
Mission Impossible 3 does a lot of the same things as these movies. It questions if Ethan should go through with the difficult decisions presented to him, such as whether or not he should steal the rabbit's foot for Davian, or if he's right to go to such extremes to save Julia. The film forces Julia to make some difficult decisions of her own, like when she has to kill Ethan in order to save him, and also depicts an attack on US soil for the first and only time in the series. That sequence is especially noteworthy because it features several shots of Ethan and Luther going out of their way to protect civilians, another first for the series. Other similarities to the era include Ethan engaging in cruel and unusual punishment at a time when the ethics of that were being brought into question, and the rabbit's foot being located in China, the country SARS had just been discovered in a few years earlier. It's worth bringing up that the film had been in production since 2002, which means that an earlier incarnation of the script was getting worked on around the time this was in the news. Coupled with long-debunked conspiracy theories that SARS was a bioweapon created by the US to destabilize China, and, just as with MI2, it's hard not to draw comparisons between reality and fiction. Intention almost seems secondary in cases like this. It doesn't matter if they were explicitly inspired by this stuff. The connection is right there, and it paints a vivid picture of what people were thinking about at the time. A pretty neat and definitely unintentional connection involves Lawrence Fishburne getting cast as the IMF's director, Theodore Brassel. The movie tries to string you along into believing that he's part of some greater conspiracy before revealing that he's just a hard-ass with the weight of the world on his shoulders. And he's the first minority character in a position of power in the series.
Excuse me, did you just throw a title at me, Mr. Musgrave? I don't care if your daddy plays golf with the president. This is intelligence. So far, I haven't seen any.
His presence feels peak mid-aughts when you consider that Obama would announce his candidacy for president only 9 months later, before winning the 2008 election and becoming the country's first black president. Especially if you recall all of the conspiracy theories from the era and how they questioned his loyalty to the country.
I'm concerned about, someone that, cohorts with domestic terrorists such as Ayers.
I have to tell you, he is a decent person and a person that you do not have to be scared as President of the United States. Now, I just...
Past all of that, though, is the tone of the film itself. Despite its similarities to the previous one, Mission Impossible 3 is about as grounded as it can be given the franchise it's a part of. Though we never find out what the rabbit's foot is, it gets treated more seriously than Chimera since nobody willingly injects themselves with it for leverage during a confrontation. More time than ever is dedicated to giving Ethan a personality and a relationship to fight for. And the action is brutal in a way that it wasn't in any of the previous movies. Like that moment when Ethan goes all Jim the Cannibal Phelps on Musgrave. Everything about it reflects the world it was made in. A world where people had recently experienced a more pervasive sense of danger than they had in the past, as well as one where they understood that the lives of loved ones could be at risk. The film included Julia for the same reason that The Dark Knight had Rachel, Casino Royale had Vesper, and the prequels had Padme, to give Ethan a loved one to fight for and, should he fail to save her, someone to mourn.
You don't trust anyone, do you, James?
No.
Then you've learnt your lesson.
However, unlike each of those other characters, Ethan succeeded in saving her. As that iconic banner above President Bush once said, mission accomplished. Right? Like, this is it, isn't it? The video will end here because he saved his wife and they get to go live happily ever after. Maybe buy a home and raise a pack of Ethan hunter-gatherers. Right?
Wrong.
Okay, so Ghost Protocol marks the moment that the Mission Impossible movies start to change. For starters, Ethan and Luther aren't the only characters to return past the movie they were introduced in. We now have a cameo from Julia, and Benji's just a straight up part of the gang now.
Masks.
Yes, Benji. Yes, masks. Anyway, this one also has what I consider to be the first modern Mission Impossible stunt. Because while the previous movies had stuff like the Langley drop, the free soloing, and the knife bit, Ghost Protocol has the Burj climb, a sequence that coincidentally calls back to the free soloing from Mission Impossible 2 and represents a greater move towards serializing the series. And that's the real kicker with this movie. It's the most sequel-y sequel of the bunch yet. Ghost Protocol premiered on December 7th, 2011. We were in the middle of Obama's first term. The iPhone had ushered in the age of smartphones, and Rihanna's We Found Love was #1 on the charts. I don't have anything to say about that one, other than it works within the context of Julia's cameo, though. And maybe Luther's, because him and Ethan are kind of friendship goals at the end of this.
You still corny, Ethan.
At any rate, Ghost Protocol wastes no time revamping the series' formula for the 2010s. Though shades of the gravitas from the third movie are still here, this one begins to break away from that individualism I spotlighted several chapters ago. By having more than Luther return for this adventure, director Brad Bird lays the foundation for one of the most defining characteristics of the modern MI movie: Ethan's found family. A dedicated team that'll follow him so long as there aren't scheduling concerns, or they object to getting killed off. Bird's entry in the franchise gave him friends. More importantly, it gave him friends around the time that Facebook was in the middle of transforming the meaning of the word, and while they were averaging 100 million new users per year. In a lot of ways, that's the key connection that this movie has with real life. It's all about the seeming transformation from the old series formula and everything it represented to the new one. A redefining of the series, just like Facebook and the idea of friends. Ethan and Luther may have been friends in the other movies, mostly Mission Impossible 3, but this is the one where Ethan's relationships with other people are firmly developed. Unlike in the original series, where there was little in the way of character development, he gets to grow a bit. At a time when it was becoming easier than ever for people to communicate and connect with each other, Ethan Hunt was beginning to open up to his peers and treat them like more than coworkers. It expresses a level of trust in his friends that's reflected in every movie from here on out, as he begins to rely on them in each story's climax in ways that he hadn't in the previous ones. In many of the earlier movies, his posse would often take a supporting role in the last 15 to 20 minutes, while Ethan, the individual, would fight off most of the baddies on his own. But starting here, they're right there with him, getting into their own fights, or doing something mission critical until the last second. The idea of transition is woven into other parts of the story too. MIGP has this repeated message of putting the old ways behind us. The story hinges on the Russian government blaming the US for an attack on the Kremlin, and tensions rising to levels that hadn't been seen since the Cold War. Yet while foreign relations are backsliding, it's also about Ethan trying to prevent a full-on escalation into a mad scenario. To do this, he ultimately manipulates an SVR agent into helping him.
You wanted me to find you. Hospital?
AKA putting the US and Russia's Cold War history behind them in favor of a new start. Kinda like the New START Treaty from 2010, which was intended to cut down on the deployment of strategic nuclear warheads by both countries by 1/3. We can also observe transition in the IMF's tools by comparing them to what Ethan had back in Mission Impossible 1. Whereas the first film took America's temperature at a time when many new technologies were just coming out, Ghost Protocol features more fully realized tech that's still recognizable to what we have today. There are smartphones, tablets that can render backgrounds a bit like the volume, facial detection, drones that happen to be controlled by the most 2011-ass camcorder, the Canon Vixia, etc. For all of the technological and social change we've experienced since Obama's first term, the basic hardware we use isn't that radically different from what was available back then. At least not in the same way that this technology was radically different from what was available in the entries from before it. And tangentially, there's even a nice metaphor to be had when we try to tie gadgets to Facebook and social media as a whole. Even though their gadgets failed every time they tried to use them, the gang's intelligence and skill enabled them to improvise and get the job done anyway. The key takeaway from this is that Ethan's friends were the reason the bad guy got stopped in the end. Ethan didn't rely on fancy gadgets to get the job done. He relied on his, and I'm aware of how on the nose this sounds, social network.
I mean, look, we were unprepared, in the dark, disavowed. And the only thing that functioned properly was this team.
Another instance of transition and trying to put the past behind us comes courtesy of some behind-the-scenes gossip. Word on the street at the time was that Paramount was interested in replacing Cruise as the lead of the series. These rumors came out following the lower-than-expected box office performance of Mission Impossible 3, coupled with some, let's just say, erratic behavior. It resulted in reports that the studio was positioning Jeremy Renner as the new face of the series, basically wanting to do what Universal did with the Bourne Legacy a year later. Though they never followed through with this, it isn't hard to see how they tried to set this up. After all, Renner's character Brandt is given an even clearer arc than Ethan in the story, and gets to do his own version of the Langley drop that had appeared in every mission up to then. You also have the film dropping the franchise's numbering system too, going with the subtitle Ghost Protocol instead. Heck, they allegedly wanted to drop the Mission Impossible part of the title entirely and have Ghost Protocol stand on its own 2 feet, like Nolan did with The Dark Knight. Other than reflecting the 2010s love of reboots, remakes, and requels, this attempt to pivot the series can be read as a move to reorient it for a new generation. It's an acknowledgement that these movies have been coming out for a while and that it's time for something new. But while some may have taken this as a sign to let the series end on the exceptionally strong note it would have back in 2006, because remember, mission accomplished, guys, Paramount decided not to.
Mission accomplished!
The series was brought back in the 90s due to the strength of its name, and they wanted to keep the good times going for as long as possible. They wanted change without having to change anything on some level, and I think there's something notable about that. If Ghost Protocol deals heavily with themes of transition, and the film itself was supposedly trying to transition the series from one lead to another before failing and sticking to Cruise, then that might reflect something about this moment in history, such as the proliferation of nostalgia in the 2010s and society's seeming inability to let go of yesterday. To borrow the title from Olivia Ovenden's 2019 Esquire article on the subject, the 2010s were when we got hooked on the past. The decade was largely defined by our relationships with our phones and social media, as well as the introduction of engagement-driven algorithms and constant access to reminders of years gone by. And even when our phones weren't reheating yesterday's leftovers for us, the past found a way into the media we consumed, either through revivals of classic properties or new ones that amalgamated favorites from our childhood. Nostalgia itself wasn't new, but it had become a bigger part of our lives. Hawkeye's presence in this film and the rumors surrounding his inclusion embody the era's trend toward never letting go of the past. The happy ending we got at the end of MI3 is followed up with one that charts the series' new main course. Things are good now, and everyone's safe, but Ethan has to keep working. He has to keep taking impossible missions because a happy ending for him means a lack of one for everyone else. The only thing he has going for him beyond his work are these brief moments of quiet with his friends, and his check-ins with Julia. It reminds me of a sentiment that's shared in the Vox article, "Culture in the 2010s was obsessed with finding community and building walls," a piece where author Emily St. James talks about the ways in which different works of art expressed a need for community amid a complicated, harrowing world. The part that really stuck with me comes at the end of the piece and goes, "We told stories about community in the 2010s because we longed for a place we had lost, a place that might never have been real to begin with. But we also told those stories because we wanted to believe something better might take its place. What Ethan lost was the promise of settling down, and each of the following movies go out of their way to remind us of that." The next time we saw Ethan Hunt was 4 years later. From here on out, Mission Impossible finally decided to settle down with a single director, Christopher McQuarrie. McQuarrie and Cruise had already worked together on a few projects, with McQuarrie writing and directing 2012's Jack Reacher, and writing 2008's Valkyrie, as well as 2014's Edge of Tomorrow. The guy even provided uncredited rewrites on Ghost Protocol. Mission Impossible Rogue Nation debuted at the Vienna State Opera on July 23, 2015. Donald Trump had just announced his candidacy for president a month earlier. Gamergate was a year old, and Cheerleader by Omi was the #1 song on the Billboard Hot 100. I literally have nothing to say about this song. I only heard it for the first time while I was researching this video, and it sounds like a mostly inoffensive pop song from the era. I kinda wish Bad Blood by Taylor Swift was at #1 as opposed to 4 though, because then I would have been able to word salad something about that would have tied into this movie. Rogue Nation finds Ethan on the run from the CIA as he hunts down a nefarious group that was teased at the end of the last movie. The syndicate is led by a rogue British agent named Solomon Lane, and is a consortium of what were thought to be dead agents from organizations around the world. Their goal? Raise anarchy and challenge Western interests. So, terrorism. Though the first Mission Impossible existed as a pseudo-continuation of the original TV show, the Syndicate being treated as a new threat stands in direct contrast to that. The 60s show had a syndicate. They were basically shorthand for the mob, with maybe a bit of 007 Spectre thrown in for good measure. Yet in this one, they're an entirely new group that was initially created by MI6 as a shadow operation that only the Prime Minister can control. The Syndicate evokes several things from the decade, like Brexit, private militias like Blackwater, and terrorist organizations like ISIS.
You're a terrorist. If that were true, then my goal would be to spread fear, but my method is far more surgical.
You kill innocent people.
They represent the inspiration for Brexit because the United Kingdom European Union membership referendum was held a year later and had been promised to British voters by British Prime Minister David Cameron in 2013. The decision to leave was driven by a number of factors, but the one that can be traced back to Rogue Nation was a greater desire for British sovereignty. A number of people in the country wanted to answer to no one and nothing aside from British interests. Not unlike how the Syndicate was created to only answer to the Prime Minister, who we can assume would also have British interests in mind. As for the private militias connection, the concept of guns for hire that are happy to go to war for a good payday is far from new. Blackwater had been in the news since the time of Mission Impossible 3. However, Rogue Nation's the first time that this subject was ever breached in the series, and it came out at a time when members of the group were still in the news. And its last inspiration, well, It's ISIS. I mean, come on, that one's obvious, isn't it? The Syndicate was all about destabilizing Western influence. They're textbook fictional terrorist group, and ISIS was the major terror group in the news at the time. There's a strong sense of timeliness to Rogue Nation's subject matter. The mid-2010s seemingly brought a mainstreaming of conspiratorial thinking. I've already name-checked Gamergate, and a sizable number of the folks involved in it bought into the conspiracy that games journalists, critics, and developers were corrupt and trying to force diversity into the medium. 2016 brought us Pizzagate, 2017 brought us QAnon, and so on. Conspiracies were all over entertainment too. 2014 gave us Captain America: The Winter Soldier, a Marvel Goes political thriller where it turns out that the Nazi-affiliated cult Hydra has been hiding in the shadows since the end of World War II. And Daniel Craig's run as 007 reintroduced Blofeld and Spectre for the first time since the 80s in order to retcon his adventures, just a few months after Rogue Nation dropped. Though a 2022 study states that there hasn't been a measurable rise in conspiratorial belief between 2012 and 2021, that same study points out that this doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't become a bigger part of society. And looking at just how many popular movies from this period focused on these questions, it feels like it had. Rogue Nation has Ethan getting treated like a madman for believing that the Syndicate is real, and takes things one step further by suggesting its own conspiracy, that Ethan is the Syndicate and that he's using them as justification to run around with zero accountability for his actions.
Hunt is both arsonist and fireman at the same time. I believe that the Syndicate is a figment of his imagination, created to justify the IMF's existence.
So there are multiple levels of conspiratorial thinking at play here. There's the main conspiracy of MI6 trying to cover up the existence of the Syndicate. There's the way that Ethan gets treated like a mad conspiracy theorist for believing they exist. And then there's the suggestion that Ethan himself is the Syndicate. This all leads to a greater conversation about whether the IMF should even exist. A point that aligns with questions pertaining to accountability that were all over popular media at the time. In the mid-2010s, we got movies like Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, and Captain America: Civil War. Stories that ask the same basic question. Hey, do people want us to do this? Are we helping or are we hurting? At the turn of the decade, we were still occasionally rooting for Mavericks to go against the status quo. We cheered when the Avengers fought off the Chitauri, and we cheered when Jake fought alongside the Na'vi in Avatar. But by the middle of the decade, we were starting to doubt ourselves, and at the same time, we were developing the habit of admitting defeat at the hands of some evil person, organization, or conspiracy that had been pulling the strings from the shadows. If there's one thing that describes 2015, it's this sense of doubt in the world around us. It's a huge proponent of conspiratorial thinking. It reflects what the war on terror had turned into. And it foreshadows two major threats from the years to come: misinformation and disinformation. Ethan was back on the scene just 3 years later thanks to Mission Impossible Fallout. This one was first screened in Paris on July 12, 2018, a year into Donald Trump's first presidency, a year after the international launch of TikTok, and a few weeks out from TikTok merging with Musical.ly. Oh, and Drake's Nice for What was number 1. Yeah, I've got nothing for this one, sorry. Fallout took the serialization angle that the later films have been beginning to define themselves with very seriously. Rogue Nation is only a sequel to Ghost Protocol insofar that the events of the fourth movie directly inform the first act of this one, along with there being a reference to the Syndicate in it. But Fallout is a proper direct sequel. It takes what was established in the fifth movie and actually builds off of it. Though we have a new big bad in the form of Henry Cavill's August Walker / John Lark and his terror group the Apostles, Walker answers to Solomon Lane and the Apostles are little more than table scraps from the Syndicate. Because of this, a lot of what I said about Rogue Nation still applies, albeit with the odd development here and there. The Apostles are even more of a stand-in for ISIS since you can consider them a splinter group comprised of former Syndicate members, similar to how ISIS was formed by remnants of Al-Qaeda. Likewise, where Rogue Nation continued to develop Ethan's Ohana by adding new members to it,
Welcome to the IMF, Mr. Secretary.
Fallout brings Julia back with a proper appearance as opposed to a cameo. She's there to iron in the message that ended Ghost Protocol. Ethan is loyal to the game, and the safety of the world comes at the cost of his happiness. The introduction of Vanessa Kirby as Max's daughter, Alana, the White Widow Mitsopoulos, is a nice compliment to this, as it shows that Ethan's been in the game for so long that he's now running into the kids of his old contacts. The greater distrust of the IMF returns in this movie too, with the CIA's director Erica Sloan acting as this movie's prerequisite official that doesn't trust Ethan or his methods until the end of the movie when it turns out he was right all along. Like I said almost an hour ago, these movies are very templatized. This has basically happened in every movie so far, with Alec Baldwin's character Hunley even acting like we didn't watch him accuse Ethan of being a traitor in the very last movie.
Good God, Ethan, don't make this any harder than it already is. I can no longer protect you, don't you understand that?
Ilsa's government using her to cover their tracks by having her take out Lane continues to further that Brexit angle I mentioned earlier too. It's barely there to the point of being tangential, but yeah, it's still there, and it's an example of Great Britain acting in pursuit of their own interests again. Similarly, the reveal that Walker and his evil mustache was John Lark all along continue the theme of conspiracy, just after QAnon picked up traction online. There's even a nice bit of metatextual fun to be had when you consider Cavill's most iconic role being Superman and Snyder's reinterpretation of the character being a messianic figure.
What's the S stand for?
On my world, it means hope. Hope is not a strategy.
You must be new.
However, that's not to say that Fallout doesn't bring its own ideas to the table. I found it timely how the big threat in this movie involved a nuclear weapon being used to contaminate the largest source of clean water on Earth. It was an interesting angle for them to go with things, and I found it poignant given how stuff like the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Flint water crisis were still in the public consciousness in 2018, as well as how society had been becoming increasingly aware of environmental concerns over the years. This point got unintentionally underlined for me when I realized that a decent chunk of this movie takes place in Paris too. You know, the Paris from the Paris Climate Agreement, the one that the US said they would back out of in 2017 and began to actually back out of just a year after this movie came out. Though the Paris Climate Agreement has zero direct connections with Mission Impossible Fallout, it's still hard not to think of it when you take a step back and look at the plot. It's right there. Last, and perhaps most obviously, the movie touches on the ideas of dis- and misinformation. The cold open ends with a sequence where Benji finally gets to mask up and uses the opportunity to stage some fake CNN coverage of a nuclear attack. The movie positions this as a necessary means to get some much-needed information out of someone, but make no mistake, it's still absolutely a mirror image of the hot topic of fake news from the time. And I'm not the only one to pick up on this either. Jen Chaney's write-up of the film for Vulture mentioned it too. Pat Castles also pointed to this moment in his LARB article and cited several other publications that had picked up on that, like Vanity Fair. The thing that stuck out to me about this scene is that it's so laid back about the whole thing. There's a nonchalance to how it portrays false information that, coupled with the time the film came out, feels representative of a societal decay in our ability to parse truth from fiction. A decay that we're still experiencing to this day, mostly because that problem has only been compounded since 2018. The Mission Impossible series would go on another hiatus after the end of Fallout's theatrical run, one that would last for 5 years and lead to the series seemingly missing a major global shakeup and returning just in time for another one. The first MI movie of the 2020s is Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, formerly Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. The film premiered in Rome on June 19, 2023, before beginning its US theatrical run on July 12th. The Earth was 3 years out from when the World Health Organization first declared COVID-19 a global health emergency. Then US President Joe Biden had just declared the pandemic was over, and both Morgan Wallen's Last Night and Olivia Rodrigo's Vampire were on top of the charts during both of the film's release dates. And funnily enough, they both kind of fit the movie. Dead Reckoning is all about modern technology failing our heroes, as their adversary, the Entity, is able to prevent them from keeping an eye on each other. If you look at daylight as a metaphor for information and communication, and night as a metaphor for the gang trying to fight the entity in a state of partial blindness, it sorta works. Both songs delve into feelings of loss, and in the case of that Olivia Rodrigo song, the imagery of a vampire. Two more things that fit in well enough with the imagery of Dead Reckoning, especially the vampirism given the fact that, much like Count Dracula, the entity is an intelligent, calculating being that isn't alive. However, if I'm being honest, I would have loved if Van Halen's Jump somehow shot up to number 1.
Jump? Jump!
The 7th movie in the franchise revolves around Ethan and his merry band of spies on a mission to acquire half of a cruciform key that could be used to either control or shut down a rogue AI known as the Entity. Along the way, a mysterious man from Ethan's past named Gabriel threatens to put a wrench in their plans, as does a pair of US agents that have been sent to find him. There's also a newcomer to the series named Grace, a thief that's gradually brought into the fold as one of Ethan's new allies. Dead Reckoning taps into a highly relevant subject from the past few years: AI's place in society and whether the continued development and use of it is playing with fire. Interestingly, the movie only came out several months after tools like ChatGPT became a household name, and its production preempts the boom of generative AI tools that took root at around the same time. That said, it isn't that surprising that Mission Impossible tackled the subject when it did. The concept of artificial intelligence has been around for ages, as has the idea of the military or intelligence community using it, such as in Captain America: Winter Soldier and Avengers: Age of Ultron or the Terminator movies. But Dead Reckoning feels especially of this moment. One of the things the film keeps repeating for the audience is that the entity can control the truth,
distorting any and all digital information with which it comes in contact.
Nothing recorded, stored, or transmitted digitally can be trusted.
Whoever controls the entity controls the truth.
A self-aware, self-learning, truth-eating digital parasite.
At first, the US intelligence community wasn't that concerned about it, as it only seemed to be interested in distorting online news and social media. By their own admission, they didn't care because it usually worked in their favor. But over time, as it grew more powerful and assimilated other AIs into its code, they came to realize just how dangerous the entity was, especially after it took aim at the world's intelligence agencies and what they called the truth itself. But rather than clothesline that Frankenbot into the nearest vat of molten steel, they decided that they should try to control it and wield it as a weapon.
So what if we do develop this solanite bomb? We'd be even a stronger nation than now.
Stronger. You see? You're stupid minds. Stupid!
Hearing all of this in 2025 should probably raise a few alarm bells since, as I'm sure you already know, the US has recently started letting so-called AIs crawl through government websites and selectively erase things that they've deemed are too woke. Stuff like pages for the Enola Gay and Jackie Robinson, among many others. Another example we can look at is a recent study from NewsGuard that concluded that the Russian network Pradva is flooding the internet with disinformation that's designed to get picked up and amplified by chatbots like ChatGPT. In a slightly roundabout way, it's AI being used to control the truth. This is why I find Dead Reckoning's emphasis on truth fascinating, because while the filmmakers had no way of knowing just how prevalent tools like ChatGPT would be when they announced this film in 2019, they had a firm enough grip on culture to assume that an eventual AI would be used to control information. Add to that the very run-and-gun approach to filmmaking that Macquarie's Mission Impossible movies have employed, as well as the many production delays and rewrites that this film experienced due to COVID-19, and you've got a movie that got a lot of the concerns about AI right. In the 2 years since the release of this film, we've seen everything from AI get used in the context of war, to AI getting used to impersonate someone's voice, to using it to create a deepfake, or stolen data being used to train it. There's even a recent study by Microsoft that used a survey to conclude that an over-reliance on the stuff can atrophy our critical thinking skills. All of these things appear in the movie, down to Gabriel being the entity's stooge with no autonomy of his own. The The sole exception to that are the deepfakes, which are in the movie but are the work of Phineas Freak over here.
How did you do that? No one is safe from Phineas Freak.
And to wrap up this section on AI, here's some weird trivia for you. Dead Reckoning was apparently the partial inspiration for an executive order on artificial intelligence. Yeah, I know. It's kinda nuts, and if we're being honest, pretty funny. Like, I can't help but picture Biden watching this movie in some Ebenezer Scrooge-ass pajamas one night and staring in horror as the entity uses Benji's voice against Ethan. I don't know. The thought of that just makes my brain happy. But like, in all seriousness, it's like I've been saying. Movies are often a snapshot of the world, and this one just so happened to really nail its timing. Another thing I thought would be interesting to take a look at is the film's fixation with deconstructing the Mission Impossible formula. There are multiple instances when Dead Reckoning pauses to comment on the mechanizations of an MI movie. We can see this when Briggs points out how Ethan always seems to go rogue.
He always goes rogue. Him and his merry pack of prankster circus freaks. That's all they do.
Or when Gabriel correctly predicts that Paris is gonna betray him.
You will betray us. And you'll tell Ethan Hunt everything you've learned.
Paired with its many references to other films, such as a shot of a stroller on a staircase as a maybe reference to Battleship Potemkin and De Palma's The Untouchables, or the many similarities to the 007 franchise, it gives off a strong sense that we've been here before. And sure enough, we have. In many ways, Dead Reckoning often plays like a greatest hits of the series. After transitioning into a serialized formula, the franchise is cashing in years of fan service and doubling down on having fun with itself. Kittredge is back for the first time since 1996. Ethan has to think on his feet during a sandstorm. He has to fight someone on top of another train, and an agent has to chase him around the world before becoming a hesitant ally. They even brought back Luther's nicknames from the first movie in order to justify him not being in the third act.
Ethan, would you care to explain to our friend the Net Ranger how I am just as capable of writing code as he is?
No comment.
Oh, what, you figure that Phineas Freak here is going to single-handedly work out a way to kill the entity while I just hold his soldering iron?
Probably.
Definitely.
This all reminds me of a seeming trend in our algorithm-driven world. A general dumbing down of material into easier to parse and, to borrow a phrase that's been tossed around by Netflix as of late, make things more second screen friendly. It's a kinder way of saying that material is deliberately being made to require less work to follow so that people can multitask while they watch it. To take less big risks and instead rely on patterns and well-worn plot points that anyone can pick up should they get distracted by their phone, happen to be folding laundry, or manically scribbling notes onto their iPhone so that they can make a video essay about the entire series as a whole. Though I don't think this directly applies to Dead Reckoning, it's hard to argue that this movie doesn't hold your hand more than previous entries did, or that its self-awareness toward its own tropes doesn't strike a similar nerve. More than ever, Mission Impossible lives in its formula and expresses a feeling of nostalgia. Now, I previously said that the 2010s were defined by nostalgia, and I stand by that. Yet I also believe that the same can be said about the 2020s so far because of COVID. Though the film itself never mentions COVID, it's one that has the virus's fingerprints all over it. It reminds me of something I read in Danielle Campoamore's New York Times article, Why We Reach for Nostalgia in Times of Crisis. The quote goes, "Things just seemed easier in the before times, when we weren't sheltering in place, losing our jobs, or potentially exposing ourselves to a virus that has killed over 140,000 Americans. But in times of trauma and overwhelming stress, it's a natural instinct to feel nostalgic and rely on those things for comfort and a sense of normalcy." The article goes on to cite Dr. Valentina Stoysheva, a clinical psychologist who said that trauma takes away our gray areas. It divides our timeline into a before and an after. And while it has the danger of creating this longing for the before, when things were maybe safer and when we were unaware of all of this and protected by our naivete, there's also something about nostalgic behaviors, fashion, clothes, movies, music that serve as a transitional object. In a lot of ways, it almost feels like Stoysheva is describing Dead Reckoning and a number of other post-lockdown movies that exhibit a great fondness for the past. Many of these movies allude to the before times without mentioning the pandemic once, and are stories about regret and loss. They may be fun and use humor to make the medicine go down easier, but there's a poignancy to them. These films feel different because of what the audience had just been put through. Unlike Avengers Endgame, a movie where characters physically return to the past and one of them stays in the past, these movies are largely about how we can't change what's behind us. They use the imagery of heroes that have been with us for decades and that we look up to, and they mostly revolve around the message that we can't get back what's gone and that the best we can do is keep working toward a brighter future.
Well, it's good to see you, dear boy.
It's good to see you.
How are you?
Trying to do better.
For Dead Reckoning, this means continuing the work to stop the entity, as well as prepping a new generation of potential IMF agents to pick up on Ethan's work. And following in the steps of the era that brought us our first black and woman vice president, our first South Asian FTC chair, and the most diverse administration in US history, coincidentally pulling together a pretty diverse set of candidates in the process. Which brings us up to now. Or back to now, if you're watching this from several years in the future. That's an option too, I guess. I initially thought it would be fun to tie things together by sharing some predictions for how Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning would play out, and how it might reflect 2025. But it didn't take long for me to realize that that wouldn't be a good idea. You see, a lot of what I spoke about today wasn't obvious to people at the time these movies came out. In fact, a lot of the ways people can spot historical relevance in media seldom is. It turns out that the old saying, hindsight is 20/20, is somewhat true when it comes to history. We often need time to process events and gain greater insights into the significance of a moment or how we were trying to process it. The time we spend away from something is important because it makes it easier for us to go back to something someday and look at it more thoughtfully. The truth is that I don't know what The Final Reckoning will say about 2025 because I haven't seen it yet, and the world that'll be the reference point to which people compare it someday is still developing. I don't know what'll happen in it outside of some franchise standbys that I can assume it includes. Yes, it'll involve some awesome stunts. Tom Cruise is probably gonna run a 5K at some point. The IMF will succeed in stopping the entity. Or not. But the stuff that really matters, that cultural garnish that's allowed the series to rinse and recycle the same blueprint for nearly 3 decades without getting old? Yeah, I can't exactly mainline the next 6 months of C-SPAN to find out what they'll be, and I'll still need some time after the film has been released and the year has ended to figure out what they are. While it's true that movies reflect the times they were made in, a lot of the deeper meaning that gets ascribed to them comes from hindsight. We may have an idea what something means after we've seen it, but we'll often still need time to look back at it and pick up on the ways in which it's similar to the work surrounding it. Even when a work was designed to be a metaphor for something real, it's still up to the audience to decode that meaning, and they may not be ready to at the exact second it comes out, or have all of the necessary context to. I took a few art classes in college as an elective, and one of the things that really stuck with me was the importance of doing what's called a squint test. It's when you take a step back from a project and physically squint at it so that you can't focus on the minute details you may have been inclined to fixate on, and you're instead able to look at the piece as the greater sum of its parts. A similar idea in writing is to take whatever you've just written and put it away for a while. Just throw it in a drawer and forget it existed for however long it'll take you to come back to it with fresh eyes. And I feel like the same basic idea applies to reflecting on art. In my last video, I discussed the idea that movies are usually an unchanging art form, and that the constant developments we undergo as people might influence how we view the same movie over an extended period of time. And well, the same idea applies here, albeit on a larger cultural level. It's not just that we've changed, it's that we have access to additional context on the past that can affect our relationship with it too. This leads to a concept I like to call canonicity, or as it's also called, hegemonic narrative, accepted history, or mainstream historical perspective. It's basically the idea that everything in history is, to some extent, subjective. Our interpretations of a movie are just that, an interpretation, one that's guided by social values at the time we're looking at it. To use the popular expression, history is written by the victors as a jumping off point, the value of a movie being used to reflect on the past is only as good as whether or not it reflects a commonly accepted reading of an event or era, aka hindsight. Here are a few obvious examples of this. Disney's Song of the South reflects social values that were very normalized in 1940s America, right? But our modern takeaway that it's a snapshot of the era's racism came much later. People needed time away from it for its place in historical canon to get formed. Here's one from this video itself. Mission Impossible 3's commentary on the War on Terror wasn't lost on a lot of people back in 2006. What was lost, though, was how its ending worked as a bittersweet encapsulation of our extended stay in the Middle East. We needed additional experiences in order to end up like Socrates in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Dust. Win. Dude.
This is also why we can reflect on films that never sought to be a commentary on anything as documents of the past. It's not hard to revisit the early days of 007 movies and sit mouth agape at how they treated women or other cultures. But that doesn't mean that You Only Live Twice was trying to criticize Orientalism. It was just being Orientalist. Okay, here's one last one. One of the films I cut to when I was discussing post-lockdown cinema was 2022's Top Gun Maverick. It's a movie that absolutely fits in with many of the other ones I brought up, but happens to have been shot before the pandemic started. Yet that doesn't really matter because its emotions are real and are timely. It's a movie about the past haunting you and the struggle to move forward, something that billions of people were experiencing post-2020. My point is that hindsight is 20/20 on these things, and realistically, we want some hindsight when we look at art. Our constantly shifting relationship with the art we consume is a feature, not a bug. That reaction we get in the pit of our stomach when we listen to characters talk about Chimera is a good thing, because it means we're acknowledging the uncomfortable realities of the world right around the turn of the millennium. And when we allow ourselves to acknowledge those fears and call them out for what they are, we can begin to process and work through them. If the tonal whiplash from MI2 to 3 threw you for a loop, that might mean that you'd get something out of trying to observe that contrast in other films. There may be value in you revisiting Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies and observing how Spider-Man 1's optimism and resolve gave way to our hero expressing doubt and nearly becoming the thing he set out to protect people from in only 5 years. I opened this video by saying that movies are like a Polaroid of the time they got made, and I stand by that statement, to the point where I think that metaphor also explains how we can approach handling them. When we use films as a document of the past, maybe we should treat them like a stack of Polaroids we've found in a shoebox under our bed. We should review them with hindsight in mind, remembering all the good times and fun we had in those days gone by. But we should also remember some of the bad stuff, or apply a bit of afterthought toward the things we thought we knew back then, and the truths that have since been revealed. Treating movies this way fulfills one of the great purposes of art, to encourage a communication of ideas and introspection. Taking the time to do an exercise like this is important because it encourages you to think in terms of gray. To practice nuance. It isn't always going to be about the literal answers you'll find from looking at movies differently, so much as it's about encouraging yourself to think about the world and its history in general. Because just as how the Mission Impossible series slowly introduced serialization over the years, many of the things happening in the world today, and many of the things we derive meaning from in the art we interact with, have roots in the past. I genuinely tried to go this whole video without saying what might be the greatest history cliche of all time, but there's no better way to put it. As George Santayana once said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So the next time you're revisiting an old favorite, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to consider the world that bred it, and to take note of the way things have or haven't changed since then. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you consider subscribing or sharing it with a couple of friends, maybe answering the question of the day if you haven't already, etc. Additionally, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting this channel, you could do so by checking out my Patreon or by becoming a channel member. Last, you could stalk me on Letterboxd if you want. So yeah. Bye.
Benji, open that door right now! Yeah, I'm trying.